The door was too quiet. Grace Whittaker noticed it before she noticed the king, before the silver horns above the high table gave their low warning note, before every noble in Thornridge Castle turned toward the arched entrance with that careful, hungry stillness people reserved for power. She noticed the door because doors were part of her world. Not the kind that opened for her, never those, but the kind she scrubbed around, polished, carried water through, slipped behind when someone important wanted the hallway empty. The north door should have breathed. Outside it, winter pressed against the castle like a living thing. Snow had been falling since dusk, thick and dry, whitening the battlements, burying the carriage tracks, turning the courtyard stones slick beneath the boots of men who cursed quietly while pretending not to be cold. Every time that door opened, even a crack, the hall usually felt it. A blade of wind, a thread of frost, the smell of pine smoke and horses and iron lanterns swinging in the dark. Tonight, there was nothing. No cold through the seam beneath the oak. No sound of the outer guards changing position. No muffled stamp of royal horses waiting beyond the wall. No carriage chain knocking against its hook. Only silence, sealed too tightly around the doorframe, as if someone had taken the entire winter night in both hands and held it still. Grace's fingers slowed around the linen cloth she was using to wipe a spill of mulled wine from the flagstones. She was kneeling near the eastern pillar, where servants were supposed to be useful and invisible at the same time. Her gray wool dress scratched at her knees. Her white apron was damp at the hem from melted snow tracked in earlier by guests who had not looked down to see what they left behind. Her hair, pale brown and pinned badly because she had dressed before dawn, had slipped loose near her cheek. She did not raise her head. Maids who raised their heads at the wrong moment became stories told in kitchens as warnings. So Grace kept her eyes lowered and let them move only where they were allowed to move. Across boots, hems, spilled wine, chair legs, shadows, the lower half of the world. That was how she saw the second wrong thing. The two men standing outside the north door were wearing Royal Guard cloaks, but their boots were dirty with black marsh mud. There was no marsh within 5 miles of Thornridge. The courtyard outside was packed with snow and gray stone. Real guards would have white slush clinging to their soles, bits of salt, maybe the yellow dust from the stable yard if they had crossed near the horses. Not black mud, not the wet, sucking kind that dried and cracked scales along leather and left a sour mineral smell behind. Grace knew that smell. Her hand tightened around the cloth until wine-dark water ran between her fingers. At the high table, laughter rose and fell among the lords. Candles trembled in iron branches. Music from the gallery drifted above the room, soft enough to flatter conversation and loud enough to hide secrets. No one else was looking at the door. Why would they? Doors opened when men of rank wished to pass through them. Doors closed when servants were told to stay out of the way. Doors did not matter unless you were the kind of person who lived your life being pushed through them, barred from them, or punished for standing too near them. Grace shifted slightly, pretending to scrub a stubborn stain. The man on the left outside the north door moved his hand once beneath his cloak. Not much, barely a flex of his fingers. But the man beside him answered by touching the inside of his wrist. A signal. Grace's breath caught so softly that no one heard it. Then the silver horns sounded. The Alpha King had arrived. Grace lowered her eyes before anyone could remind her to do it. That was the first rule of Thornridge Castle. Not written on any door, not spoken during hiring, not stitched into the plain gray uniforms the maids wore until the wool thinned at the elbows and knees. But every servant learned it quickly enough. Eyes down, hands busy, mouth closed unless a question was placed in it by someone with the right to expect an answer. Grace had learned it at 16, on her first winter in the castle, when she had looked too long at a visiting lord's jeweled dagger and been accused of planning to steal it. She had learned it again at 18, when a drunken nobleman had spilled wine across her apron and laughed while the housekeeper deducted the damaged linen from Grace's pay. She had learned it a third time, and more permanently, when Mrs. Bellamy had taken her by the chin outside the scullery and said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "Pretty girls who forget they are servants are corrected harder than plain ones." Since then, Grace had made an art of being forgettable. She walked close to walls. She stepped around conversations before anyone needed to make room for her. She carried trays level, poured wine without splashing, polished silver until her fingers smelled of ash and vinegar, and apologized so quietly that the apology seemed to belong to the room rather than to her. She knew which lords kicked backward when drunk, which ladies preferred their gloves warmed before supper, which guards accepted bread from the kitchen girls, and which ones reported them for theft afterward. She knew Thornridge better from the waist down than most nobles knew it from the throne room. The cracks in the flagstones, the draught beneath the chapel door, the loose hinge on the west pantry, the places where candle wax gathered in pale ridges, the servant stair that creaked on the seventh step unless you pressed your weight to the left, the north corridor where snowmelt always collected in a thin shining line after the outer door opened. Tonight, that line was missing. Grace kept wiping the same wine stain while the horns finished their long silver note. Around her, the great hall rearranged itself. Chairs scraped softly, backs straightened, conversations folded inward and vanished. Even the musicians in the gallery lost half a measure before recovering. Power did that. It moved through a room before the man carrying it fully entered. Mrs. Bellamy appeared at Grace's shoulder like a shadow with keys. "Move," she whispered. Grace shifted closer to the pillar, cloth clenched in her hand. She knew better than to ask why. Maids did not ask why the world made space for kings. They only learned how not to be crushed when it did. The main doors opened. Cold swept in from the front of the hall, real cold, sharp with snow and horse leather and pine torches. Grace felt it touch her cheek and understood, with a slow tightening under her ribs, that the front doors still breathed exactly as doors should. Only the north door did not. And the two false guards outside it were waiting for the Alpha King to walk straight into silence. The Alpha King did not enter like a guest. Guests entered with announcement and appetite, with cloaks shaken free of snow by servants and voices lifted just high enough to be heard by the important people already inside. Guests paused beneath the banners to be admired. They smiled at old allies, measured old enemies, accepted cups before they had earned thirst. Rowan Blackwood crossed the threshold as if the castle had been built with his arrival in mind. The cold came with him first, a clean, violent sweep of winter air that rolled across the flagstones and lifted the edges of every candle flame in the hall. Then came the sound of boots. Not rushed, not heavy for the sake of being heard, simply certain. Each step landed with the calm authority of someone who had never needed to ask a room to make space because space had always known what to do with him. Grace saw his boots before she saw anything else. Black leather, travel-worn but polished, the soles marked with real snow from the front courtyard. A thin crust of white clung near the heel, already melting into clear water on the stone. No marsh mud, no false dirt, no borrowed cloak pretending to belong to another man. Whatever else Rowan Blackwood was, he had come through the winter honestly. Behind him moved 6 royal guards in dark armor trimmed with iron, their faces unreadable, their hands relaxed but close enough to their weapons that relaxation itself seemed like a warning. 2 councilmen followed farther back, speaking to no one. And at Rowan's left shoulder walked Beta Masonvale. Grace noticed him because she had trained herself to notice the person standing just behind Power. Mason was tall, blonde, finely dressed in midnight blue, handsome in a smooth and expensive way that made people trust him before he had done anything to deserve it. His smile was small, his posture perfect. The silver ring on his right hand caught the candlelight when he adjusted his sleeve. Grace's fingers went still against the cloth. At the high table, every lord rose. Not all at once. Pride delayed some of them by a heartbeat. Fear corrected the delay. Chairs scraped backward in a wave. The music thinned and died completely. The great hall, which only moments ago had been crowded with laughter and wine and territorial arrogance, became a held breath. Rowan did not look impressed by it. He was taller than Grace had expected, though every story had already called him tall. Broad through the shoulders, narrow at the waist, wrapped in a black fur-lined cloak fastened at the throat with a silver wolf clasp. Dark hair, wind-touched from the storm, framed a face cut in clean, masculine lines. Strong jaw, straight nose, mouth unsmiling, eyes the pale gray of ice under morning light. Handsome, yes, but not softly, not safely. His beauty was the kind attached to blades and mountain storms and things that did not apologize for being dangerous. Grace looked down before she could be caught looking up. Still, the room changed around him. She felt it more than saw it. The way noble women lowered their voices. The way dominant wolves angled their bodies without meaning to, each one recalculating where they stood in relation to him. The way even Mrs. Bellamy, who feared almost nothing below the rank of duke, folded her hands at her waist and became still. Rowan reached the center aisle. Mason leaned close to him and murmured something Grace could not hear. Then Rowan's gaze shifted toward the north door. The quiet door. The sealed door. The door with false guards and black mud waiting on the other side. Grace's stomach tightened so sharply she nearly dropped the cloth. She bent lower, pretending to gather it, and saw Mason's right hand move again. His thumb touched the silver ring once. Twice. Outside the north door, the false guard on the left answered by flexing his fingers beneath his cloak. Grace forgot to breathe. Rowan Blackwood, Alpha King of the Northern Crown, had not yet taken 3 more steps, and already someone in his own shadow was counting them. Grace saw the third wrong thing when Mason smiled. It was not a full smile. Men like Mason Vale did not waste full expressions unless there was an audience worth performing for. This was smaller, placed at the corner of his mouth and gone almost before it existed, the kind of smile that did not belong to pleasure. It belonged to timing. Grace had seen that expression before. Not on his face. Never close enough for that. Until tonight, Beta Mason had existed for her the way all high-ranking men existed for servants. As boots to avoid, voices to obey, shadows that changed the temperature of a corridor before they entered it. But she knew the shape of men waiting for something already arranged. She knew the stillness of a hand that had given a signal and expected obedience. Her father had taught her that before she understood why fathers needed to teach daughters such things. A trap is never only the blade, he used to say. A trap is everything around the blade pretending to be ordinary. Grace kept her head bent and watched the ordinary things. The north door had no breath beneath it. The 2 guards outside wore royal cloaks but stood too close to the hinges, leaving the center path open in a way real guards never would. Real guards protected the king's body from the room. These men protected the door from being questioned. Their shoulders were angled not inward toward the hall, but outward toward whatever waited beyond the oak. The man on the right had his sword belt buckled too high. The man on the left had marsh mud on both heels. Mason's silver ring touched candlelight again. Once. Twice. Not nervous. Not idle. Deliberate. Grace's mouth went dry. She turned her wrist slightly, wringing the cloth against the stones as if the stain required all of her attention. The wine had already been wiped clean, but nobody noticed servants doing unnecessary work. That was one mercy of being invisible. People only saw you when you stopped serving. Mason leaned toward Rowan again. "My king," he said, voice smooth enough to travel without seeming loud. "The Northern Council has requested a private word before the accord is sealed." Grace knew enough to know that was wrong. The Northern Council had entered before supper, all 6 of them, heavy men in gray fur with rings braided into their beards and snow still melting on their shoulders. They were seated 3 tables from the dais, arguing softly over venison and border maps. None of them had left. None of them stood waiting outside in the cold. Grace knew because she had carried bread to their table twice and replaced one of their knives after a lord snapped the tip against a bone. Rowan did not answer immediately. He looked toward the north door. Mason's hand moved again. This time, Grace saw what clung beneath the cuff of his sleeve. A pale dusting at the edge of the fabric. Fine. Metallic. Almost beautiful in the candlelight. Silver ash. Her stomach folded inward. There were old stories about silver ash. Hunters used it around wolf traps when they wanted a shifter weakened before the arrow struck. It clung to leather, cloth, skin. It dulled scent. It confused blood. Her father had come home once with it burned into his palms after dismantling a snare near the eastern ridge. He had spent 3 days unable to shift and never cursed where Grace could hear him, which frightened her more than if he had screamed. Mason Vale had silver ash on his sleeve. The false guards had marsh mud on their boots. The north door had gone silent, and the Alpha King was being led straight toward it. Grace stood before she had given herself permission to stand. It was a mistake. She knew at the moment her knees left the stone and the damp cloth slipped from her fingers into the cleaned place where the wine had been. Servants rose when summoned. Servants moved when ordered. Servants did not unfold themselves from the floor in the path of kings because they had noticed mud, silence, and a pale dusting of silver ash beneath a beta's sleeve. But Rowan Blackwood had already begun walking toward the north door. One step, then another. Mason moved beside him with the careful ease of a man escorting power toward its own ending. Grace's body acted before fear could finish naming the consequences. She stepped out from the pillar. Not far. Only enough that the hem of her gray dress left the shadow and entered the torchlight. Only enough for Mrs. Bellamy to see her. Only enough for the nearest guard to turn his head and narrow his eyes as if a broom had spoken. "Grace," Mrs. Bellamy whispered. It was not a question. It was a warning with her name attached. Grace swallowed. Her throat felt scraped raw, though she had not yet said anything. Across the aisle, Rowan's cloak shifted as he walked, black fur brushing the backs of his boots. Mason's right hand hung relaxed at his side now, ring turned inward, signal already sent. "My king," Grace said. The words were not loud. They should have been swallowed by the hall, by music, by laughter, by the thousand small sounds of a feast. But the feast had gone too still around Rowan, and stillness carries disobedience very well. Several heads turned. Mrs. Bellamy's fingers closed around Grace's wrist hard enough to bruise. "What do you think you are doing?" she breathed. Grace tried to pull her hand free. Not violently. Violence from a maid became a crime before it became a movement. She only twisted once, small and desperate, her eyes fixed on the black cloak moving away from her. "I need to tell him something. You need to remember what you are." The sentence landed exactly where it was meant to. Not in her ears. Lower. In the place where years of obedience had been stored and locked. A lord at the nearest table laughed under his breath. "Is the little maid calling to the king?" Another voice, female and sweet with cruelty, murmured, "Perhaps she wants him to notice her face." Heat rose in Grace's cheeks so quickly it hurt. She felt every part of herself become visible. Her loose hair, her plain dress, her damp apron, her hands reddened from lye and winter water. She had spent years surviving by being nothing in rooms like this, and now the entire hall was beginning to turn toward her as if nothing had made a sound. Mason stopped. Slowly, he looked back over his shoulder, and this time he did not hide his smile. "Send her to the kitchens," he said lightly. "The king has no time for servant panic." The guard nearest Grace stepped into her path. "Back," he ordered. Grace looked past him. Rowan had paused, but he had not turned fully. She could see only the hard line of his profile, the silver clasp at his throat, the faint tilt of his head as if he were listening to the room decide whether she mattered. She had one breath left before the moment closed. Grace lowered her eyes, because that was what they expected. Then she saw the fallen linen cloth at her feet. White. Clean enough. Small enough to be harmless. Her fingers curled. If they would not let a maid speak, then she would have to serve her way into being heard. Grace let the linen fall. Not far. Not dramatically. It slipped from her hand with the small, helpless flutter of a servant dropping something because fear had made her clumsy. No one would remember the cloth. No one ever remembered the tools that kept a castle clean. It landed in the aisle just ahead of Rowan Blackwood's boots. The guard in front of Grace cursed under his breath and reached for her arm, but she was already moving. Not running. Running would have ended with steel at her throat. She moved the way a maid moved when correcting her own mistake, fast enough to be useful, low enough to be forgiven. "My apologies," she whispered, though she did not know who she was apologizing to anymore. She stepped around the guard, bent at the waist, and reached for the cloth. Rowan stopped. His boots were inches from her fingers. The hall went silent in a way it had not been silent before. Not respectful now. Dangerous. This was the silence of people watching a rule bend and waiting to see who would be punished for it. Grace picked up the linen with one hand. With the other, she caught the edge of Rowan's cloak. Only the edge. Only a fold of black wool near the silver clasp where it had shifted slightly from his shoulder. It was the kind of correction she had made 1,000 times for lesser men who never thanked her. A servant's gesture. Harmless. Necessary. Invisible, if performed for anyone except a king. Every royal guard moved. Not fully. Not yet. But their hands changed. Fingers found hilts. Shoulders tightened. One wolf gave a low sound in his chest that Grace felt more than heard. Mason's face sharpened. "Remove her," he said. But Rowan raised one hand. The movement was small, almost lazy. The room obeyed it instantly. Grace's heartbeat struck so hard against her ribs that she thought he must feel it through the air between them. She kept her eyes on the clasp. Silver wolf head. Iron teeth. A king's emblem cold beneath her fingers. She adjusted the cloak. Then she leaned close. Not to his ear. She would never have reached it without standing on her toes, and she did not dare make the movement obvious. She leaned only as far as a maid might lean to smooth the fabric over his shoulder, her face turned toward the dark line of his collar, her voice thinner than breath. "Don't go," she whispered. "They're waiting outside." For 1 second, nothing happened. No shout, no blade, no hand closing around her throat. Only Rowan Blackwood looking down at her. His eyes were pale gray, colder up close than they had seemed from the floor, and far more awake. They did not widen. They did not soften. They moved across her face once, not like a man admiring a pretty servant, but like a hunter reading tracks in new snow. Grace forced herself not to look at Mason. That was the hardest part. Fear wanted direction. Accusation wanted a target. But her father had taught her better than that, too. Never look at the trapper when the trap is still open. Rowan's voice came low enough that only she could hear. "Who?" Grace's fingers smoothed the cloak one last time. "The men wearing your guards' cloaks," she breathed. "They are not yours." Something changed in him then. Not his expression, not his posture. Those remained carved from the same dark stone. But the air around him tightened, drawing every sound in the hall toward a point. Behind him, Mason said, "My king." Rowan did not look away from Grace. For the first time in her life, a powerful man looked at her as if her fear might contain information instead of inconvenience. Then he said, calm and quiet, "Open the north door." Mason smiled. Grace's stomach dropped. Rowan added, "Without me." The order did not move through the hall like a shout. It moved like a blade being drawn slowly enough for everyone to understand the sound. "Open the north door." "Without me." For half a breath, no one obeyed. Not because they had the courage to refuse Rowan Blackwood, but because the command had cut across the shape of what everyone expected. Kings walk through doors. Guards open them. Servants stepped aside. Bait as advised. Rooms followed the old arrangements because old arrangements made fear easier to manage. This order broke the arrangement. Mason's smile remained on his face, but Grace saw the life leave it. "My king," he said smoothly, "the council is waiting." Delaying them may be taken as an insult. Rowan did not turn toward him. Then let the door insult them first. A sound moved through the room. Not laughter. No one was brave enough for laughter. It was a thin collective intake of breath, swallowed almost immediately. One of Rowan's royal guards stepped forward. He was older than the others, broad in the chest, with a scar running from the corner of his mouth into his beard. His hand rested near his sword, but his eyes were on the north door now, not on Grace. "What would you have us send through, sire?" Rowan finally looked away from Grace. "Your cloak." The guard understood at once. He unfastened the dark royal cloak from his shoulders and pulled it free. The iron-trimmed fabric fell heavy in his hands, black as a raven's wing, marked with the silver wolf crest at the back. Another guard took a spear from the wall display beside the pillar, the ceremonial kind used during feasts and oaths, its blade polished more for beauty than war. Together, they draped the cloak over the spear shaft. From a distance, in torchlight, it made the shape of a man. Grace could hear her own breathing now. Too shallow, too fast. She tried to slow it, but her body had moved beyond manners. Her fingers still held the linen cloth against her chest. She had forgotten to let it go. Mason took one step forward. "This is absurd," he said. Rowan's eyes cut to him. Mason stopped. The two false guards outside the north door had not moved. Grace could see their shadows beneath the seam. For boots. Too still. Waiting. The scarred royal guard approached the door with the spear held low. Another guard reached for the latch. The room bent toward the moment. Grace did not blink. The latch lifted. The oak door opened no wider than a man's hand. Cold should have rushed in. It did not. Instead, the spear bearing the cloak was thrust through the narrow gap. The first arrow struck before the cloak cleared the doorframe. Silver flashed across the dark. Then the second. Then the third. They hit so fast the sounds became one violent crack, driving through the royal crest exactly where a heart, throat, and lower ribs would have been if Rowan Blackwood had walked through that doorway himself. The hall died. Not quieted. Not paused. Died. The cloak hung skewered on the spear, pinned in 3 places, the silver arrowheads gleaming with wet poison under the torchlight. Beyond the door, someone cursed. A body shifted. A boot scraped against stone. Then the cold finally came in. Sharp. real, filled with snow, metal, and the sour bite of marsh mud. Grace's knees weakened, but she did not fall. Rowan looked at the ruined cloak. Then he looked at Mason. No rage crossed his face. That was worse. Rage would have been human. This was something older and more controlled, a winter lake freezing from shore to center. The council, Rowan said softly, has excellent aim. Mason's mouth opened. No words came out. Outside, steel rang as Rowan's guards surged through the door and dragged one of the false guards into the hall. His royal cloak tore open as he hit the stone, revealing leather armor beneath, black marsh mud on his boots, and a silver-loaded crossbow strapped against his ribs. A noblewoman screamed. Someone knocked over a chair. Mrs. Bellamy's grip loosened from Grace's wrist, as if she had only just realized she was touching the woman who had kept the king alive. Rowan turned back to Grace. The whole hall turned with him. For years, Grace had feared being seen. Now every eye in Thornridge Castle was fixed on her, and the silence around her no longer sounded like punishment. It sounded like proof. Mason found his voice in the exact moment Grace lost the room. That is how she knew, he said. The words were not loud, but they carried because everyone was waiting for someone of rank to explain what fear had just made obvious. A king had nearly died. A maid had warned him. A false guard lay bleeding on the stones with a crossbow full of silver strapped to his ribs. The order of the world had tilted too sharply, and rooms like this always reached for the nearest familiar hand to set it upright again. Mason offered his. He pointed at Grace. She knew because she is part of it. The silence changed. Grace felt it happen. A moment earlier, every eye had been fixed on her with stunned recognition. Now suspicion began to move through the hall like spilled ink through water. Faces tightened. Shoulders shifted. A lord near the center aisle stepped back from her, as if betrayal were something a servant might carry on her skin. Grace's fingers went numb around the linen. No, she said. The word was too small. Mason took a step forward, recovering himself with frightening speed. The smoothness returned to his face, though his eyes had sharpened into something bright and cornered. A maid sees an ambush Royal Scouts missed, he said. A servant notices trained assassins through a closed door. She whispers to the king at the exact second before the attack, and we are meant to believe this is loyalty. Mrs. Bellamy released Grace completely. Grace stood alone beside the pillar, damp apron, loose hair, red hands. Every part of her suddenly turned into evidence against her. She had access to the corridors, Mason continued. She could have opened the outer passage. She could have told them which door His Majesty would use. That is enough, Rowan said. It was quiet, but the room obeyed. Mason bowed his head. My king, I am trying to protect you. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. You are trying to survive me. No one breathed. Then Rowan turned to Grace. How did you know? That question frightened her more than Mason's accusation. Not because Rowan asked it cruelly. He did not. His voice held no threat, no softness, no promise of rescue. Only attention. Exact, cold, unbearable attention. Grace looked at the north door. At the mud dragged across the threshold. At the ruined cloak still pinned to the spear. At the silver ash smeared faintly along Mason's cuff where he had failed to hide it. And behind all of that, she saw her father's hands. Thomas Whitaker's hands had been large and scarred, always smelling faintly of smoke, iron, and pine resin. He had not been a lord. He had not worn silk. But once, before Grace became a maid and before their name became something people avoided saying, he had served as a trap reader for Royal Scouts. He could look at a broken twig, a wrong shadow, a patch of ground too clean, and tell where death had been hidden. Grace had been 9 when he taught her that doors were never silent without a reason. She had been 12 when he was hanged for treason. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. My father read traps for the crown. Mason went still. Rowan saw it. Grace saw Rowan see it. His name was Thomas Whitaker, she said. He found a silver ambush near Eastmere Pass 10 years ago. He tried to report it. 3 days later, he was accused of selling patrol routes to rebels. A murmur moved through the hall. Grace lifted her eyes, not to Rowan, but to Mason. The order for his execution was signed by a young beta newly raised to court. Mason's face had gone bloodless. Grace's fear did not leave her. It changed shape. I recognized the mud because Eastmere marsh dries black. I recognized the silver ash because my father came home with it burned into his palms. And I recognized the signal because he showed me the last note he ever received before they killed him. Rowan's voice was almost gentle. Who signed it? Grace looked fully at Mason Vale. The same man standing beside you tonight. Mason moved before anyone decided what to do with the truth. It was not a lunge at Rowan. He was not foolish enough for that. He moved sideways, one hand flashing beneath his cloak toward the narrow blade hidden along his belt, his body angling toward the nearest servant corridor. Men like Mason Vale always kept an exit. Even in betrayal, especially in betrayal, they trusted architecture more than loyalty. He made it 3 steps. Rowan did not raise his voice. Take him. The royal guard struck as one. Steel flashed, boots hit stone, and Mason was driven to his knees so hard the sound cracked across the hall. His hidden blade skidded from his hand and spun across the flagstones, stopping inches from Grace's worn shoes. It was thin, beautiful, and dark along the edge with something that smelled faintly bitter beneath the metal. Poison. A noblewoman covered her mouth. Someone whispered a prayer. The false guard on the floor tried to move and was pinned harder by the scarred captain's boot. Mason looked up at Rowan, with fury finally breaking through the polish. You believe a maid, he spat. Over your beta? Rowan crossed the distance between them slowly. Each step seemed to press the hall deeper into silence. Grace had never seen a man so controlled around rage. Rowan's face remained calm, but the torches along the wall shivered, as if the stone itself knew something in him had opened its eyes. No, Rowan said. I believe the arrows in my cloak. I believe the silver ash on your sleeve. I believe the mud on dead men's boots. And I believe the woman who warned me when silence would have saved her. Mason's jaw tightened. She is nothing. The words hit Grace with less force than they would have an hour ago. Nothing had been her shelter for years. Nothing had let her pass through corridors unseen. Hear conversations no one guarded. Notice the small wrong things powerful men ignored. Nothing had kept her alive. But it had also been a cage, and for the first time, someone else looked at that cage and did not mistake it for truth. Rowan turned away from Mason. He looked at Grace. The entire great hall followed his gaze. Grace wanted to lower her eyes. The need rose through her body from old training, familiar and cruel. Eyes down, hands folded. Apologize for taking space. But the blade lay at her feet. The ruined cloak still hung on the spear. The north door stood open behind the guards, breathing winter at last. So Grace did not look down. Rowan removed his own cloak. Not the pierced one. The one still resting over his shoulders, black wool lined with dark fur, heavy with snow melt and the scent of pine, iron, and cold air. He stepped toward her, and every servant near the pillar moved back as if afraid to be struck by the meaning of what he was about to do. Grace stood very still. When he placed the cloak over her shoulders, its weight nearly made her knees bend. Warmth closed around her. Royal warmth. Forbidden warmth. The silver wolf clasp rested against the front of her plain gray dress, bright and impossible above her damp apron. A sound moved through the room. Shock. Protest. Wonder. Mrs. Bellamy pressed both hands to her mouth. Rowan turned to the hall. This woman is not under accusation, he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It reached the high table, the servant doors, the musicians frozen in the gallery, the guards holding Mason down, the nobles who had laughed when Grace tried to speak. She is the witness who saved your king. No one moved. Rowan's gaze swept the room with winter precision. She saw what my counsel missed. She spoke when men of rank lied. She risked punishment, humiliation, and death to give me one sentence of warning. His eyes stopped on Mason, and that sentence kept me alive. Mason struggled once beneath the guards. Rowan did not blink. Beta Mason Vale is stripped of title, blood right, and command. Search his chambers. Seal his correspondence. Anyone who aided him will be brought before me before sunrise. The scarred captain bowed. Yes, sire. And Grace Whittaker, Rowan continued. Grace's breath caught at the sound of her name in his voice. Not little maid. Not girl. Not servant panic. Her name. She is placed under my direct protection. No hand touches her. No tongue slanders her. No order is given to her except through me until this matter is judged. A lord near the high table shifted. Your Majesty, surely the word of a maid cannot. Rowan looked at him. The lord stopped speaking as if a blade had found his throat. Her word outrank yours tonight, Rowan said. Remember that before you waste another breath. For the first time in her life, Grace saw powerful people become careful around her. Not kind. Not yet. Kindness was too easy to perform. This was better. They were careful because the Alpha King had made her visible and wrapped consequence around her shoulders. Mason was dragged toward the guard passage, still fighting, still cursing her father's name until Rowan took one step after him and the curses died instantly. Grace watched him disappear. She expected triumph. Instead, what rose in her chest was grief, sharp and clean. For Thomas Whitaker. For the years his name had been buried under a lie. For the girl she had been, learning to read doors because the world had taken the man who taught her. Rowan stood beside her, close enough that his shadow covered the blade at her feet. "You should have been heard 10 years ago," he said quietly. Grace looked at him then. Not at his boots. Not at the clasp. At him. "So should my father." Rowan's expression changed, only slightly, but enough. The cold authority remained. The king did not disappear. But behind it, something human moved. "He will be," Rowan said. Outside, snow continued to fall beyond the open north door. Inside, the great hall of Thornridge Castle remained frozen around a maid in a king's cloak. Grace had entered that evening as the girl who scrubbed stains before anyone noticed them. She stood now before nobles, guards, traitors, and the most feared Alpha King in the north as the reason he was still breathing. She had not been chosen by bloodline. She had not been saved by beauty. She had seen the truth when everyone else looked past it, and she had dared to speak before the door closed. And from that moment on, no one in Thornridge Castle could pretend not to see her again. The East Tower was too warm. That was the first thing Grace noticed after the hall, after the arrows, after Mason Vale was dragged away with his title stripped from him like skin from bone. Warmth should have comforted her. Instead, it made her uneasy. Servants' rooms were never warm enough to make a person forget the weather. They were built in the parts of a castle where heat arrived tired, after it had already served everyone important. This room had a fire large enough to turn the stone walls gold. Grace stood just inside the chamber door with Rowan Blackwood's cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, uncertain what to do with her hands. The room was not grand in the way nobles like to be grand. It was spare, guarded, controlled. A carved bed against the wall. A heavy table with maps pinned beneath silver weights. A wash basin of steaming water. 2 narrow windows looking out over the north courtyard where torches were moving through snow like restless stars. Royal guards searched the dark below. Every few minutes, one of them called to another, and the sound came up thin through the glass. Grace listened because listening was easier than thinking. Mrs. Bellamy had tried to take the cloak from her before they left the hall. Not cruelly this time. Carefully. Too carefully. As if Grace had become something fragile and dangerous in the same breath. Rowan had stopped her with one look. So the cloak remained. It was heavy on Grace's shoulders, heavy with meaning more than fur. She could still feel the place where the silver clasp rested against her dress. Not as decoration, as a warning to anyone who entered. The scarred captain stood outside the door. His name, she had learned, was Captain Alden Pierce. He had bowed to her before closing the chamber behind them. Bowed. To Grace Whitaker, who had spent that morning scrubbing soot from kitchen stones. She had almost stepped aside to see who he meant it for. Now she stood in a king's private tower room and tried not to shake. Rowan was at the table, reading the first papers pulled from Mason's chambers. He had removed his gloves. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, steady as he turned each page. No wasted movement. No visible anger. Only that terrible patience the hall had feared more than fury. At last, he set one letter down. Your father was telling the truth. The word struck harder than any accusation had. Grace did not answer. For 10 years, the world had trained her to hear Thomas Whitaker's name with shame attached to it. Traitor. Informer. Rebel mouthpiece. A man hanged before dawn so his daughter could inherit silence. She had known he was innocent. Knowing was not the same as hearing a king say it. Rowan looked at her, and this time she did not lower her eyes quickly enough to pretend she had not been crying. There are patrol maps here, he said. Payment ledgers. Names. Mason used your father's report to expose the ambush, then blamed him before he could speak. Grace's hand found the edge of the cloak and closed there. My father begged them to let him stand trial. I know. Her breath caught. Rowan's face did not soften in any easy way. He was still the Alpha King, still built of winter and command, still a man who could end lives with 2 words spoken quietly. But his voice changed when he said the next part. I found the petition. The room blurred. Grace turned toward the window before the tears could make her look like the kind of woman people expected servants to be when pain finally caught them. Small, grateful, broken in acceptable shapes. Outside, men were digging through snow for dead assassins and hidden proof. Inside, the fire cracked softly, bright and indifferent. My mother wrote that petition, Grace whispered. She died waiting for an answer. Rowan said nothing for a moment. Then he came to stand beside her, not too close, not touching, but near enough that his reflection appeared beside hers in the dark window glass. Tall, broad, shadowed in firelight. A king standing next to a maid wrapped in his cloak. No one answered because Mason made sure it never reached the throne. Grace closed her eyes. The grief did not come like a storm. It came like a door opening in a house she had believed empty for years. When she opened her eyes again, Rowan was watching the courtyard. By sunrise, he said, Thomas Whitaker's name will be restored before the council. Grace turned to him. And Mason? His jaw tightened once. We'll live long enough to hear it. For the first time that night, something fierce and unfamiliar rose through Grace's sorrow. Not relief. Not gratitude. Justice. She looked down at her red, work-worn hands, the hands that had scrubbed floors, carried trays, wiped blood and wine and soot from other people's worlds. The same hands that had caught a king's cloak and pulled him back from death. They will say I was lucky, she said. Rowan looked at her then. No, he answered. They will say you were trained. They will say you were brave. And if they forget, I will remind them. Grace believed him, not because he was kind, because every man in Thornridge Castle had learned tonight what happened when Rowan Blackwood decided a truth belonged to him. By dawn, the castle had learned to whisper Grace's name. Not loudly. Thornridge did not know how to speak about a maid loudly unless she had broken something, stolen something, or given someone powerful a reason to laugh. But whispers traveled where announcements could not. Through servant stairs, under pantry doors, between guards changing watch with blood still drying on their cuffs, across the kitchens where bread was being kneaded by women who had stopped pretending not to listen. Grace heard none of it at first. She sat in the east tower beside the fire with Rowan's cloak folded across her lap, because she had finally taken it off and immediately felt colder without it. Captain Pierce had brought tea she had not asked for and placed it on the table as though delivering supplies to a battlefield. She had thanked him. He had bowed again, lower this time, and left before she could decide what to do with the shape respect made in the room. The sun came slowly, pale and reluctant, staining the snow outside the narrow windows blue before it touched gold. Below, the courtyard had been turned into proof. 3 assassins bound and guarded near the armory steps. 2 dead under white sheets. A row of confiscated weapons laid on black cloth, silver arrows, wire snares, a crossbow with the royal crest scratched crudely into the stock, and 7 sealed letters taken from Mason's chamber. Grace looked at the letters longer than she should have. Paper had killed her father before rope ever touched him. A false report. A hidden petition. A signature with enough rank beneath it to make the truth sound like treason. Rowan had not slept. She knew because he stood exactly where he had stood an hour ago, at the map table with his sleeves rolled to the forearm and a candle burning low beside his hand. Men came and went. Guards, scribes, councilmen with faces drained of color. Rowan spoke quietly to all of them, and each left looking as if the castle stones had shifted beneath their boots. At last, the great bell sounded once. Not for feast, not for ceremony, for judgment. Grace rose before anyone told her to. The cloak slid from her lap into her hands. She looked at it, uncertain whether to leave it behind. Rowan saw. Wear it, he said. She stilled. They will stare. They already do. That is not comforting. No, he said, and something almost like warmth crossed his voice. But it is honest. So Grace put the king's cloak back over her shoulders. It was too large, too heavy, too much. The hem brushed the floor behind her, black against her gray dress, royal fur against servant wool. She looked like a girl wearing a storm. But when Rowan opened the chamber door and the guards outside straightened, no one laughed. The walk to the council hall felt longer than any corridor she had ever scrubbed. Servants pressed themselves to walls as she passed, then looked up at the last second, unable not to. Grace recognized some of them. Mara from the laundry, Ben from the stables, old Edith from the scullery, who had once smuggled Grace soup when she was feverish. Their eyes moved from her face to the cloak and back again. Not envy, not fear. Hope, maybe. Small and dangerous. The council hall doors opened. Inside, every noble of Thornridge waited. Mason Vale knelt in chains before the dais, one cheek bruised, his blonde hair loose and stripped of its careful elegance. He looked up when Grace entered, and hatred flashed across his face so nakedly that it no longer seemed powerful. Only frightened. Rowan walked to the center of the hall. Grace stopped behind him, but he glanced back once. Not behind. Beside. The correction was silent, but she understood it. With every eye in the room watching, Grace stepped forward until she stood at the Alpha King's right hand. A murmur rose. Rowan let it live for one breath. Then he placed Thomas Whitaker's stolen petition on the council table. 10 years ago, he said, an innocent man was hanged so a traitor could keep his seat beside the crown. Grace felt the room tighten. Rowan's voice lowered. Today, that lie ends. And for the first time since she was 12 years old, Grace heard her father's name spoken in a hall of power without shame attached to it. The council did not want to believe a dead servant. Grace could feel that before anyone spoke. It moved through the chamber in stiff backs, tightened mouths, rings turning on noble fingers, the careful refusal of powerful men to look directly at proof when proof made them smaller. Thomas Whitaker's petition lay on the long black table between Rowan and the council, its edges yellowed, its seal cracked, its words no less true for having waited 10 years to be heard. Mason knelt below it in chains. He looked different without rank standing around him like armor. His midnight blue coat was torn at one shoulder. Silver ash still marked the cuff of his sleeve, pale against the dark fabric. A bruise had begun to rise along his jaw where Captain Pierce had driven him to the floor. Yet, even kneeling, even bound, Mason Vale kept his chin lifted like a man waiting for the room to remember who he had been. One of the elder councilmen cleared his throat. Your Majesty, he said carefully. The matter of Thomas Whitaker was settled under lawful authority. Grace's hand closed inside the fold of Rowan's cloak. Lawful authority. That was what they called it when a poor man died neatly enough to avoid disturbing dinner. Rowan did not answer at once. He looked at the elder with that quiet patience Grace had learned to fear on behalf of anyone foolish enough to mistake it for calm. Lawful, he repeated. The elder's face paled slightly. According to the records presented at the time. Rowan placed another document on the table. The sound was small. Everyone heard it. These records. The elder did not move. Captain Pierce stepped forward and unfolded the page. Patrol routes sold to rebels. Signed confession. Witness statement from Beta Mason Vale. Mason's mouth tightened. Rowan set down a second page beside the first. And this is the original route ledger from Eastmere Pass. Taken from Mason's locked chest before dawn. No one breathed. Grace looked at the page though she could not read it from where she stood. She did not need to. The room understood before her eyes could. Councilman leaned forward. One noble whispered something sharp and was silenced by the woman beside him. Captain Pierce read aloud. The routes Thomas Whitaker was accused of selling were changed 3 days before the ambush. Only 3 men had access to the new routes. The Crown Scoutmaster, the acting Beta liaison. His eyes moved to Mason. And Mason Vale. Mason laughed once. It was a bad sound. Dry. Cornered. Convenient, he said. Very convenient that papers appear after a maid whispers in the king's ear. Grace felt the insult slide across the room toward her, familiar as cold water. A maid. Always the smallest possible word for her. Rowan turned his head. Mason stopped laughing. You keep saying maid, Rowan said. As if the word protects you from what she saw. Mason's eyes flashed. What she saw was what she was told to see. Grace stepped forward before fear could catch her. No one ordered her back. That alone nearly broke something inside her. I was told to see nothing, she said. Her voice was quiet. It trembled at the edges, but it carried. For 10 years, I was told my father died a traitor. I was told to lower my eyes when men who killed him walked past me. I was told servants should be grateful for work, grateful for scraps, grateful for silence. No one told me to watch the north door. No one told me your guard stood wrong. No one told me silver ash smells bitter under candle smoke. Mason stared at her. Grace looked back. Her fear was still there, but it no longer led. My father told me traps pretend to be ordinary, she said. You should have remembered that before you tried to hide one in a room full of servants. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not applause. Nothing so simple. Recognition. The servants along the wall stood straighter. Grace saw Mara from the laundry with tears bright in her eyes. Old Edith pressed one fist to her apron. Even some of the guards looked at her differently now, not as a rescued woman in a king's cloak, but as the person who had named a truth none of them had caught. Rowan's gaze did not leave Mason. Bring the witness. Mason's face changed. That was when Grace knew there was more. The side door opened, and two guards led in an old man wrapped in a healer's shawl, his white hair tied at the nape, one hand bandaged heavily. He walked with difficulty, but his eyes were clear. Grace did not recognize him. Mason did. No, Mason whispered. The old man bowed to Rowan. State your name, Rowan said. Edwin Harrow, former clerk of the Eastmere Scout Office. Grace felt the chamber tilt. Edwin looked at her then, and sorrow crossed his face so deeply it seemed carved there. I copied your father's petition, he said, and I watched Mason Vale burn the original. Edwin Harrow's testimony did not sound like vengeance. That made it worse. Vengeance would have given the council something to dismiss. A bitter old clerk. A failed man. A trembling witness dragged from obscurity to settle old debts before a frightened room. But Edwin spoke with the dry precision of someone who had spent his life copying dates, seals, routes, signatures, deaths, and lies into ledgers no one important expected servants to understand. He stood beneath the council torches with his bandaged hand against his chest and recited the night Thomas Whitaker tried to save the crown. He came to the Eastmere office after midnight, Edwin said. Mud to the knees. Silver burns across both palms. He had dismantled 3 snares along the King's Patrol Road and found rebel markers placed beneath the bridge stones. Grace could see it so clearly her throat tightened. Her father at a clerk's desk, exhausted and bleeding, asking men with clean hands to believe what his ruined ones had found. He demanded the report be sent directly to the throne. Edwin continued. Mason Vale arrived before dawn. He took the report. He said he would deliver it himself. Rowan's face did not change. Mason's did. Small muscles worked along his jaw, one after another, as if he were chewing through the words before they could reach him. But they had already reached everyone else. And then, Rowan asked. Edwin looked down. Then Thomas Whitaker was arrested before sunset. Grace's fingers curled into the fur of Rowan's cloak. Edwin's voice grew quieter, but not weaker. I copied his petition because he begged me to. He said if the original vanished, someone needed to remember what it said. He named Mason Vale in it. He wrote that the ambush could only have been arranged by someone with access to the changed patrol routes. A councilman whispered, "Why did you not speak?" Edwin turned toward him slowly. The old man's eyes were tired, but there was iron at the bottom of them. I did. The councilman went still. I spoke to 2 magistrates, one scoutmaster, and Lord Tamsin of the Eastern Bench. Within a week, my wife was threatened, my son was removed from his apprenticeship, and my right hand was broken badly enough that I never copied another official ledger again. Silence spread through the chamber. Grace understood then that her father had not died alone inside the truth. Others had stood near it. Others had been beaten back from it. The lie had not survived because no one saw it. It had survived because everyone who saw it had been taught what seeing cost. Mason lifted his head. You have no proof, he said. Edwin reached inside his coat. Captain Pierce moved instantly, but Rowan raised one hand, and the captain stopped. The old clerk withdrew a narrow leather folio, cracked with age and darkened at the edges. He held it, as if it weighed more than paper. I kept the copy, Edwin said. For the first time, Mason Vale looked afraid. Not angry, not cornered. Afraid. Rowan took the folio himself. He opened it carefully, as though touching a wound that had waited 10 years to bleed properly. His eyes moved over the page. Once. Twice. Then he turned it toward the council. At the bottom was Thomas Whitaker's signature. And beneath it, in smaller writing, Edwin Harrow's witness mark. Grace did not realize she had stepped forward until she was close enough to see her father's hand in the letters. The sharp T. The long downward stroke in Whitaker. The way the ink thickened where his burned fingers must have pressed too hard. Her breath left her. For 10 years, the world had given her only the story of his shame. Now his truth lay open on the king's table. Rowan looked at Mason. You used a loyal man as a grave for your treason, he said. Mason's chains rattled as he shifted back on his knees. No, he said, but the word had no room to stand in anymore. Rowan placed the petition beside the forged confession. One lie, one truth. The chamber saw the difference. Then Rowan turned, not to the council, but to Grace. Your father's name will be restored in full, he said. His lands, wages, and honors will be returned to his bloodline. His execution will be recorded as murder under false authority. Grace could not speak. There were too many years in her throat. So she bowed her head, not because she was a maid before a king, but because if she did not, the grief might split her open in front of them all. Rowan's voice lowered. And Mason Vale will answer for both attempts on the crown. Mason looked at Grace then, hatred burning through his fear. But the room no longer belonged to him. For the first time, it belonged to the truth her father had died trying to tell.